Well, welcome to the podcast. It's been a while since I've had one, and I'm very glad to be getting it going again. It's been a busy couple years since, and I'm very happy to have Paul Rachford here with me to inaugurate this new season, new development of the podcast. So, Paul, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me on. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you just jump in then and tell us a bit about yourself and why you're in the position you're in and everything?
Sure, yeah. I've lived here in Vancouver-Point Grey for a little over 10 years now. And I guess kind of the political side of things, I got more involved in here really in the last year or so, basically seeing our freedoms erode, the prosperity erode, and just feeling like it was time to get involved and help to turn BC around. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and what we've really seen is this just erosion in people's general prosperity, whether it's our healthcare, whether it's GDP per capita, all these kind of topics, and our education system is strained, and so across all these major areas. I would say that we're running backwards rather than forwards, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, well, I can't see any place where there isn't an erosion of the structure that holds society in place, essentially. And but I'd like to go back to, because for myself, the podcast and being publicly having conversations like this really was born out of the shock I absorbed from the COVID year. First couple of years, so for myself 2020 came along and I was pretty happy with a career teaching martial arts and things were going pretty well, and then it was like, there's some kind of wild health problem coming on, and I do want to be careful and I do want to respect the fact that if there is vulnerable people out there, we take care of them and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I tell people is that actually in 2020 I started contacting the hospitals and asking if they needed volunteers, because I've had a bit of experience working in the hospital as essentially like a porter, transporting patients around, and I had my high level first aid, and I could handle helping. I knew I could handle helping if there was like massive influx of people coming in, and I'm a healthy person. I felt comfortable taking on that risk. But they never needed any volunteers. It never actually came up. And I got VGH came back to me at one point and said, "Oh, would you like to do candy striping?" And I was like, "That's not what I'm thinking here. I thought we were in a crisis." And so I started going, "Well, what's going on? What is this? What's happening?"
Yeah, I think with COVID, we saw kind of an acceleration of maybe a deteriorating state that we were already in. And obviously there, like if you look back and you think, are we better off today than we were, pre-COVID? And very few people would say yes. And perhaps there's kind of a small group of people who benefited from it overall. But for most of us, I would say that our quality of life is not higher today than it was pre-COVID. Yeah. And that's and we look at our healthcare system locally here in BC. I mean, we look at this globally, we can also look at it locally, and from the macro to the micro, and right here in BC, we see this tremendous strain on healthcare services, and people, whether it's kind of basic primary care, or they're looking to go in for a joint surgery or things like this. We have thousands of people waiting for joint surgeries. One of our MLAs, Bruce Banman, he was talking the other day about around 1 million people who don't have kind of a primary care provider. Yeah. So these are major topics.
Okay, so yeah, that's good. And I saw Bruce's post about the 1 million people not having a primary care, and I also saw, I don't know if it was him or John Rustat, but that I think it was VGH discharged a patient onto a park bench, and it's just like, okay, so that's totally not okay, really. But let's go back. Before COVID, there was still problems in the healthcare system, and a lot of people weren't even really aware of this unless they had personally had to experience it.
Yeah.
So can you talk? So can you talk a little bit about like what the long-term problems have been that have made it this way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the long-term issues, you ultimately have to talk about the government monopoly on healthcare services, and. So, monopolies are ultimately not good for consumers. And so we see that kind of playing out. Monopolies are inefficient. They tend toward higher prices. They lack kind of innovation and competition. So we have this monopoly here in BC, and traditionally people have been kind of afraid to talk about private at all, and there's this concern around maybe that it will erode away at universal care, but that's not the point at all. The point of having some kind of like a hybrid system of public and private is really to ensure like everyone has access to good quality care. And if you look at Europe or Australia, these other kind of models, you'll see that those they have a private and a public element. So that's something that we're kind of committed to looking into and really we need to do.
Okay, so that's very interesting, and to give a sort of a shout out to Aaron Gunn, who did a nice documentary about that issue.
That was excellent. Yeah.
But okay, so the pushback from people, it was just largely sort of a knee-jerk reaction pushback, is that allowing for private healthcare to come into the game would take away from the people at the lowest rung of the ladder being able to access healthcare. And the first thing I think about is like, well, wouldn't that actually free up more of the public access healthcare, because less people would be going to that?
And that's exactly the point of it, right? You really want to make sure you're taking away that strain, so when you're going in and you need some kind of whatever care it is, that you can access that in a timely manner. And we don't want to see these stories of people who need cancer care, in some cases like going and spending money in the United States to get that care, or just not getting it because they can't afford it at all. And that's really not acceptable, and not something that, especially in a country as prosperous as we are here in Canada, with the resources that we have available to us. One of the other things I got from Aaron's documentary that I think is a good thing to sort of talk about is the idea that the government would subsidize the private clinics. So if you couldn't get the help you wanted from the public hospital, you could go to a private hospital, and then they would cover you that treatment. So it wasn't like that you were purely paying out of pocket on top of your MSP premium equivalency, right? Interesting.
Is that right?
That's and this is one of the things that we're kind of working on internally within the Conservative Party of BC is just developing our healthcare policy overall. So we have kind of experts working behind the scenes on that, and very much look forward to kind of rolling that out in the coming months. We should be doing that certainly before the election, so people have a good idea of exactly where we are. And more detailed platform. You see kind of, if you go to our website, you have kind of the high level overview of where we're going, and that will get more detailed and kind of developed as time goes by. So.
And I think that's a key thing though. And so this ties into something we were talking about before I pressed record here too, is I have a background where I've been studying traditional Japanese medicine, and now I'm going to get a license in acupuncture so that I can practice. And I firmly believe that there's a lot of value in these in this type of medicine. And as I said too, and I'll repeat this because it's so important, I think, is one of the ways would be just chronic pain management. So people with all kinds of different arthritic pains and injury pains and whatever, there's a whole bunch of it out there. Acupuncture needles can resolve those pain issues in a way that's very sustainable over the long term, and there's no drugs involved, and so that's far healthier on the body and easier on the system and all these kinds of things. But one of the problems that people face with getting acupuncture treatments is pretty expensive, because it's not covered by the MSP, right? It's kind of a private. You go to it like you go to a massage, essentially, in that sense. And so making that come under the umbrella of what the government sort of supports and reimburses would be tremendously valuable, and something that I would definitely put on the table to think about with this.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because you kind of look, there's like the traditional medical services that we all subscribe to and the government funds, and then you get into more of like broadly called maybe the preventative realm. But not, it's not really preventative, that's kind of treatment, but whether it's physiotherapy or kind of what you're involved in, those can all be, potentially tremendously beneficial to the quality of life of people, but not just to their quality of life, also to the overall system in terms of taking strain off the system as well.
Yeah.
So there's kind of multiple avenues there where it may be beneficial.
Yeah, so that's why I want to put that in the mix and just say there's an idea here, and it isn't just acupuncture and Chinese medicine, although that's just the one that I'm involved with. But you're right, like physiotherapy and massage therapies and all the other categories. And I think you hit the nail on the head though. It's like you can go to a TCM doctor and get an acupuncture treatment for an acute problem, right? Even if you broke your leg and you wanted to help the healing process go along better. But the best value in many ways is the preventative strategy. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, actually I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. One of my students in my martial art classes was talking about this, is that with the election cycles, that there's like, we're going to do this implementation of this plan, and then the next time then there's like, and it doesn't last long enough, and preventative has to be a long-term plan.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. And so that would be something that I don't see a lot of governments previously have thinking about, is let's invest in the long-term health of the people so that when they get older, they're healthier and there's less likely to go to the hospital and need the care that very costly at that time, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. This, to the extent that we can like encourage people to live, a healthier lifestyle as well. These types of that seems like could be tremendously beneficial. Mm. I mean, there's simple things that I do in my daily life, and I'm not a doctor, so this isn't like a recommendation for others. But take vitamin D. I live in northern climate, so and just kind of exercise on a regular basis and these types of things, and hopefully that will help to ensure that I don't need to go into a hospital or use the medical system too frequently.
Absolutely, and I think that ties into a bigger issue here with that connects to more of the categories of issues that are going on, is the sort of the degeneration of people's lifestyle, healthy lifestyles, the lack of that as a focus. I feel like it's harder and harder for me to get people to even think about exercising. Right, as a simple exercise. Yeah. Right, it's just like, I don't want to do that. I want to go home and look at my videos.
And we can talk about our diets too, right? I mean, go to a grocery store, walk into Safeway, and you kind of look around, and so many of the shelves are filled with processed foods and these types of things, which are not healthy for us. You're kind of better off staying around the outer ring where they have the fruits and vegetables and the meat and fish and dairy. And,
well, of course, but that's the heart of it. Is I think we've lost sense of who we are, what we are actually. We're living creatures that have evolved to have certain diets and to have certain behaviors to make our lives functional. So I always think about like the Neolithic caveman kind of idea, right?
Sure.
That person is not going to do well if they're lazy, right? That's not going to work. And if they're not eating enough healthy caloric intake, like healthy proteins, healthy fruits and whatever they can, that's not going to work either. But also they have to move around, right? They have to physically be able to move around. And that's a big part of this. And Chinese medicine has a really interesting take on this. Because one of the things that throws people off on Chinese medicine is qi, energy. And it's a big part of the theory. And people, that's too esoteric. And I get that. So what I say is, qi and blood are basically the same thing at a fundamental level. And so if you don't like the idea that you need to move your qi, you need to move your blood. That you do need to do. And everybody gets that. You have blood in your system. And people don't realize, like, when you extend and retract your arm, it's helping push the blood that has circulated to the muscles to nourish them with the oxygen from the heart back to get reoxygenated, right? Because your heart is relatively small compared to the size of the body. But so that means that if you rely on it alone to circulate the blood, it's not really enough. You need the limbs to help pump that blood around again too, right?
And maybe this ties into why, if I sit down for too long in a seat or whatever, you just you start to feel like not healthy, basically, essentially. Well, and it's like if you're just moving around, it seems to be very tied to
absolutely
health.
Well, again, think about like the caveman, roughly, right? That you can't live in the cave. You gotta go out and do things, and those things are physically demanding things for the most part. And so that's what I say. It's like, what are we? Like, what is a human being, right? And people get so caught up in the ideas in their heads. But they don't look at their bodies and say, well, I'm my body, and my body's functioning is the vehicle for my life. And how do I engage in that in a healthy way. And that ties into so many of the things going on these days that are just bizarre abstractions that people get caught up in, and it becomes more important to them than their health.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of tying that all back to kind of government here in BC and the incredible strain we have. If people get moving and live healthier lifestyle and are involved in some of these preventative and different kind of options which keep them out of the hospitals, that would go a long way toward or could be very helpful in taking some of the strain off the kind of the traditional, the pharmaceutical and the surgeries and all these types of things that ultimately happen.
So let's go into that from a different angle, because one of the concerns I have is just what exactly is driving some of the policies and implementations of going on here, because in BC, people sometimes still aren't aware of this, but we're still not letting the healthcare workers that got fired for not getting a COVID jab back into the hospitals when we have a crisis of personnel.
Yes.
So what is that? How do you explain that?
Well, it's certainly not science.
Okay.
And we've seen almost every jurisdiction in really North America, the world. I haven't checked them all, but definitely in North America, get rid of any mandates that they had, and they're still here in BC. So I guess we have to ask, Bonnie Henry, who really needs to go, what's going on there. And we're seeing it and it's not just on, there's the COVID, there's the mandate side, and there's also the safe supply side that they kind of just keep doubling down on. And yet here we are, and if you go and you look and check out how many overdose deaths there's been in the last 5, 10, even 20 years, it's just up to the right. And that's all, we've seen these kind of steady, just liberal NDP policies together. And at some point you have to ask the question, is this working? And clearly it isn't.
That's it, though. That's because I was thinking about an analogy, because in martial art training, you can test hypothesis. Is this block going to work? Well, it didn't, so don't do it again, right? There's clear consequence to bad choices.
It's common sense.
Yeah.
And this is something these are kind of like political speak. We use common sense, but it really is just look and look around us, see what's going on, and observe.
And be honest about what we observe, I think, is a big part of it. Because, so there's people like Jordan Peterson and Godsod and stuff who sort of diagnose what's going on in the left wing of the political world these days as largely very akin to a cult type thinking. It's not connected to reality, and it's not even just a political ideology. It's deeper in these people's minds than just that. Do you think that that's essentially what's going on in BC too? That's why they're not changing their direction, even if the costs are so high?
Well, when you look at how we're just continuing with these mandates and it doesn't make any sense, you start to ask these questions like, why? What's going on here? And kind of a deep ideology is really the only thing that makes some sense, where this is completely ideologically driven as opposed by any data or anything else. And who knows? I'll speculate here for a minute, but maybe after the next election is done, then maybe there's a political element to this as well, where it's you don't want to kind of backtrack immediately prior to an election, because we are in an election year. Who knows what their kind of thinking is over there, but it's clearly not healthy. I mean, we need to hire these people back. There's no question. Bonnie Henry needs to go. We've been very clear on that. We'd fire Bonnie Henry. If you haven't already, please sign the petition.
I have.
Great. Yeah. And, so the sooner we can kind of move in that direction, I think the better. And it's also really important too from a societal healing perspective, because COVID was tremendously hurtful to a lot of people, and it damaged a lot of our social fabric, a lot of the relationships, right down to kind of a familial level. So it's very important that we kind of take those steps in acknowledging that our COVID response was a tremendous failure.
Yes, okay.
And the mandates are one element of that, but the failure is much larger than just the mandates.
Yeah, that's great, because in terms of COVID, I know when I was emailing with you, there's three sort of categories that I really would want to see brought out, and that's one of them is acknowledgement that this was not a good response, that it caused a tremendous amount of damage, and that damage is still lingering. It's not over.
Absolutely.
And one of the places that really bothered me was I've been doing classes for like some elementary schools for kids. So I just come in as like a auxiliary PE teacher, basically.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And they were making them wear masks while they were training and running around, and
yes,
it was terrible. I was like, these kids are going to get this idea that they're disease vectors and that they have to they can't breathe clearly when they're exercising. And it really bothered me. And now there's studies coming out showing that developmental delays going on, and the kids are psychologically diminished because of this, because they didn't have the type of environments that schools should be.
Absolutely. I was talking with a university professor, who was telling me about, he's been giving the same exam for over a decade, and you pretty consistently see the results coming in. You know what every class, how they're going to do, and you have the kind of distribution of that. You have the tails, and then you have kind of the bulk of the people in the middle. And after COVID, we saw that the results significantly decline, far more than you've seen any of the other previous years teaching. And interestingly, kind of the tail of the distribution remained the same, where the students who were excellent remained equally excellent. The students who weren't doing well remained really poor, but that middle part of the curve shifted. And so that's one example from university. But to your point, on the kind of earlier school side, we've seen that with learning outcomes. And but we should also, when we talk about education, we should also make the point that it's not just about COVID, because there was a decline in kind of outcomes that predated that as well. And coming up here, March 9th, I think is the date, at the Hellenic Center, we're having this event on education, and we're going to talk a bit about that, because we've seen basically a couple of decades of decline in learning outcomes, and kind of where we can potentially go, and hopefully there'll be some good experts there with some keen insights for us.
Yeah, it looks like a good panel. It does. And actually, I have a sort of an not anecdotal to some degree, a thing to share about that, because I had a different experience in school growing up. I'm 43 now than the kids today do, right? And I think a lot of it isn't really necessarily helping in the end. And so again,
life before cell phones.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm specifically thinking about consequences. Yeah. Right, and so in teaching martial arts, you in karate systems specifically, but other systems, you have belts, and if you don't hit the requirements for the belt, you don't get it. Right? There's no you tried hard, here's the belt, and there's very practical reasons for that in my mind, because if I tell a student that they're capable of defending themselves and they're not, I'm putting them in danger in a way that I don't feel good about. So in these elementary classes that I've done over the years, I don't really do a belt system with them, because I only have them for maybe 5 months or something. But I will give them, I will have a grading, and then at the end of the semester, and then a certification that they can earn if they achieve the goals. And the goals are realistic to their age and everything like that. But it's yes or no. You passed or you failed. And the kids just can't handle that. If they don't, they get so overwhelmed by it, and then their emotions go all over the place. And then if they try and they don't hit that mark, they're just devastated in this way that when I was a kid, we would have tests like this all the time, and it wasn't fun to fail, but you knew that was the way it worked.
Well, and you learned a tremendous amount in that process, right? of preparing for an exam or whatever it is, and then going and taking it and succeeding or not, going through that process, and then going through it again, and over time you become a better test taker for one, but also hopefully you put in a lot of work to prepare for those kind of exams, whether it's in karate and you're going for your brown belt, black belt, whatever it is, or maybe it's orange or green, or at school, and it could be in university, it could be a standardized test, whatever that looks like, an SAT.
So I bring that up though because I think that is a component of why overall the test scores have been going down, is because the kids are being given this idea that the most important thing is that they're emotionally sort of safe, essentially, rather than being put through true tests. Because, you know, and to you know, I'm not trying to say that we should be mean to them or anything like this, but it's not actually kind to tell a child that if they don't hit the mark that they're aiming at, they'll still succeed. Because in the end, that is going to cost them in their life. And so, like, that seems to be, you know,
well, I've been an athlete my entire life, so you know, tennis is my kind of sport of choice, and I played in college and Division I level at Columbia University. You know, one thing I've learned through life is that with tennis is that you improve tremendously when you strain yourself. Yeah.
Okay, so we had a minor interruption. New equipment. This is life. So let's keep going. You have a panel discussion coming up. It's March 9th, I think.
At the Hellenic Center, 2:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon. There's excellent panelists. Lindsay Shepherd will be there.
Yeah.
She's the author of Diversity and Exclusion. We'll also have Angelo Zaduro. He's an executive director for our party. He was also involved with the Free Speech Club at UBC when he was a student there.
Okay.
And Brian Brigette will likely be there. He's an instructor at Langara College and an economist.
Okay.
And you know, we'll see how it fills out the rest of the panel.
Before we jump into it, just a little curious about like how that works. Does that mean that you're going to have a discussion and then open to questions?
Exactly. Yeah, we'll have some kind of a Q&A session for it for sure.
Okay.
So probably, you know, start off with some kind of a brief presentation and then move toward the Q&A side with the panel.
Okay.
Probably some pre-prepared, probably some live questions from the audience.
That's great, because I really think that like part of the reason I'm doing the podcasting is I want dialogues with people get involved in the conversation, right? Not just being talked to.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's great. And okay, so in terms of the agenda for the panel discussion, one of the ones that stands out, it's a big issue and it's controversial, is I would call it the nature of ideological indoctrination coming into schools, where the schools aren't just saying, here's how to do math, here's how to do research, whatever it is. It's like, here's a very controversial ideological framework, and you have to, as a child, tap into it.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I'm a parent of 3 young children, so this is a topic that I, you know, cared a great
how old are
deal.
your kids?
9, 6, and 2.
Yeah.
So you know, I care a lot about this, and it's an important thing that we talk about. Which there's a couple of things. So first of all, it's very important to just be clear that it's really the ultimate authority when it comes to raising children is with the parents. It's not with the state, not with the government. It's not the government's role to be raising your children for you. So that's very important. And then when it comes to education, you know, we're trying to support parents and give parents more choice. That's something we talk about with our party. Is choice a lot. We've also been very clear about ending SOGI. That's become kind of a flashpoint, and it's divisive, and it's, you know, something we just don't need to have.
Can you elaborate? What is SOGI?
SOGI is an acronym for sexual orientation and gender identity, so there's a lot that falls kind of under that, and that's just kind of one aspect of the ideology, though, that's more broadly being, I would say, pushed in schools, and that we would like to get back to more of just teaching children course competencies, you know, math and science and reading and writing, and not pushing an aggressive social agenda. And that's really what's going on right now in many cases. And parents, I believe, are kind of increasingly seeing that. And I don't see this as a divisive issue at all either. Like when I talk to parents on playgrounds, things like that, it's almost universal. Like they want their children to go to school and they want them to come home and have learned a bit about reading and writing and math and science and these kind of core skills. Maybe it's computer science, whatever it is.
Of course.
And they don't really want the school pushing an aggressive agenda that they may or may not agree with.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because when we were talking about like one speculation on like how is it that Bonnie Henry is still continuing with her policies, and it's like, well, it seems like she's got a framework of thinking that's tied into like a cult-like thinking. It's very, 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 we're right and there's no way we're wrong. And it feels very much like this issue is very similar, because if you talk about the idea that parents should have the fundamental rights of how their children are raised and whatever, I've never heard anybody argue against that. That's like what? Like,
Exactly.
What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, and if you look in history, it's not good governments that want to take over children's development in that way. That's scary stuff, actually. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just totally agree. It's unifying. Like, people all pretty much support this. So the fact that we're not in that direction, that these days it's an issue.
Yeah, and I'll say this too, because I don't mind putting this out there, even though there's backlash against it. Is I help people through my work in many ways. So really, as a martial art teacher, you're trying to help people develop themselves, and of course, doing acupuncture and medicine, that's to help them sustain their health. And I've dealt with some lost, confused kids, and the idea of telling them something so hard for me to even wrap my head around, that they're born in the wrong body, I can't fathom that that's a good idea at all. I just won't compute. It doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense.
Well, and we saw Danielle Smith just the other day in Alberta. She came out with some kind of pretty extended video on this, in and around this topic, and that seems to be headed in a kind of a better direction. Yeah.
Well, I think it's one of those issues where if people only understood it in a truly reasonably objective way, it would be pretty clear.
We're back again. Nice. Yeah.
So actually, this is all part of the thing, right? Is you don't get clear paths to where you want to get in life. You have to kind of go through this windy thing, and it's life. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. So I appreciate your patience. So we were talking. We're talking about the soji issue and how that's coming into the schools and what you want to. So essentially, the Conservative Party of BC's idea is basically just remove the soji curriculum. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, and ending soji is what we talk about, and I mean so that's where we've been clear on that and put out a statement on it, and that's really the path forward. So
apart from that issue, which is confusing in the sense that it's I don't know why we are having to have this conversation exactly, but there's a lot of places where that is kind of the nature of it, where it's we have to discuss this, but I guess we do have to discuss this. Is there other element? Because I remember looking at the list for the panel discussion. There's a number of things there. So is there something I missed here?
Well, standardized testing is something that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to look into that a little bit more as we kind of get closer to the panel. But we've seen this move kind of away from standardized testing, and I think a lot of parents are hesitant around that because they like the idea of having some information that they can kind of process about where their child is, and that can be tremendously beneficial if you're a parent and you're I kind of want to know where my kid is on with their skills in reading and writing, and where they are compared to other children in that kind of same age range. And then maybe there's things that they can do at home with their kids or whatever to bring them up, or whatever that looks like. So I think it's a good topic for discussion with the panel. And
and we were basically kind of talking about that idea about testing and consequence, and teaching kids to deal with the reality of that dynamic. I believe very much in the idea. So to a bigger philosophical sort of thing is, we can have collectivism, which is essentially tyrannically top-down control from power sources, authority sources, or you can have more disbursement of individual development and power dynamics in that sense.
Sure.
And I'm clearly, I know which side of the game I'm on in that sense. And so I think one of the...
I mean, this is, I'm glad you brought this up, because the whole kind of centralized versus more decentralized is an important, it's important with respect to education. It's also important with respect to COVID, for example. And you see, and with COVID, we did see, right, was this kind of tremendous centralization of more power in the hands of government. And there was always going to be that kind of temptation, especially in the time of crisis or perceived crisis, for people to centralize power in with government. And that's something that, kind of going back to COVID with respect to safeguards, I'm hopeful that in the future we'll be a little bit more cautious about the amount of power that we kind of centralize, in the event of a future crisis. And there's always there's always another crisis at some point.
Of course.
So that's
I agree, and I think that's a big part of the mentality here, though, and I can sort of tie it in this way, because I think that I've thought a lot about this. If you want society to function at towards its highest level, because there's no like absolute highest level, it's just an ongoing process, but towards that end, people need to be motivated to engage, right? And motivation is something that you can't tell somebody to just be motivated. It has to be something that sort of naturally comes up in their life in some way. So like the base, what's his name? The hierarchy of needs, right? There's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, the fundamentals, of course, you got to have a food and shelter and all this. But then you got to find what you want to engage with. And you need basic skills to do that. You need your basic math, your basic reading and writing. You need your ability to think. But you ultimately make the choice to what career you take on in that context as an individual. And if you start having like these diktats that's like everybody has to do the same sort of thing, you're actually diminishing what I would call, I use the language of calling this person's spirit. And then their spirit can't find where they're going to be most excited to develop themselves. And one of the misunderstandings people often have with this is like, if we focus too much on individualism, people will get arrogant about themselves and greedy and hoarding and this. I was like, well, that's not really the right framework to me. It's you give a person a chance to pursue the thing that they're most passionate about, that's productive towards society. That helps everybody else out, right? It's not a zero-sum game. It's everybody actually works together best when they're individually allowed to pursue their interests from a solid framework, like a foundational framework. And this is where, again, if we take up the healthcare side of things with Chinese medicine, is every single time you interact with a patient is in that moment is the choices you make, right? Maybe they have, lung issues, and so it's going to be something towards that end. But exactly what you do is up to you and that patient in that moment, and that freedom is what makes it work best.
Sure, and we start talking about the kind of the economic side of things as well, where you see that is that economic freedom that really helps to drive prosperity, and then of course within that like solid framework or foundation where you have like secure property rights, and for example, and that's something that's critically important, because if you don't have secure property rights, whether it's to your car or whether it's to the GoPro that is filming this right now, or whatever that might be, then things become very difficult and kind of chaotic. So that's a foundational element.
And that was one of these ones where it's like, I can't believe I have to like actually essentially argue that, right? Like I was talking to our mutual friend Marina, Dr. Marina. I don't want to say her last name, unfortunately. So I'll have to get her to correct me on that. But I was talking to her. But it's like, I have a visceral, instinctual resistance to anybody telling me that I don't own my life, that my life isn't mine. It just, and it's not. I can intellectualize it and sort of explain it to a certain degree, but it's not intellectual. It's deep. It's deep in my spirit, my soul somehow. And I don't know where it comes from, because I've always kind of been like this. It's always been there with me. But you start telling me that I don't get to make my own personal medical choices about what happens with my life that are not reasonable to begin with in that context, or like you're talking about property rights or rights to ownership, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah, I mean, it's very likely something that's kind of fundamental to the human condition, where we do like seek freedom and kind of autonomy over ourselves and our bodies, and that's. Yeah, I mean, bodily autonomy with respect to this, go back to COVID again, it's a very important kind of principle. Yeah. And there, especially with the kind of coercion with the mandates and things that felt violated, and I think that drove a lot of people to,
of course,
be involved in protests and the convoy movement and all of that.
Yeah, and so I was having a conversation with another person who's involved in the Chinese medicine stuff, and we were talking about a patient, essentially, a person who has proclivity to kind of look for the easy way out in a lot of ways. And I was saying that I think that is because they've never developed any strength to take on the risk and the challenge of standing up for yourself. And so they're always looking for ways to kind of avoid that.
And there is no easy way out.
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
You know, as anyone knows, who's become, you know, skilled in really anything, whether you're, you know, an incredible artist, incredible athlete, incredible business person, whatever it is in life, you know, it takes a tremendous amount of effort to become good at anything. So
for sure.
There's no easy way.
No, and so to tie that into the COVID thing, a lot of people, I think, fell back on the idea that if the authorities are telling you to do something, that something needs to be done, that they're the authorities. And it's really hard to stand up against that and say, whoa. And a lot of misunderstandings came around that too. But I believe that this is why democracy evolved, is that the power structures can fall into corruption, essentially, and at least corrupt thinking. And the proclivity towards more top-down control is easier in a lot of ways than trying to manage a whole bunch of different people's opinions. And the idea that the role of a person in a democratic society is to hold the government to account in a certain degree, in a certain context as well, and that's okay. That's what this is for. If we didn't have a democracy, then we wouldn't have. That's what democracy is for, essentially.
Well, and we've certainly seen a lot of kind of questioning recently of some of the institutions in our society, and you know, and as we've seen with let's say the provincial health officer, you know, with very good reason, people are kind of questioning what's going on there, both on the safe supply side, the COVID response, etc. But it's not just there, kind of more across society, and maybe even social media is playing a role in that. I don't know. I mean, I tend to think of the social media world today, and even what we're doing here right now, as perhaps like a modern day version of the printing press, so to speak. And I've kind of heard that. It makes a lot of sense to me, where suddenly, you know, you're able to be kind of like an independent publisher, so to speak, publishing content or books and sharing that with other people. So, you know, kind of the distribution of information in our society has changed, and we're, you know, kind of making it more difficult for institutions perhaps to kind of hold on to a narrative or push a narrative onto society which may not be accurate.
Well, that's a good thing to me, because the discussion is so important, and open discussion, and the idea that you can have pushback against ideas is what makes ideas that are strong show themselves for that, right?
Right, and hopefully ultimately that will make our institutions stronger. And then that, because those institutions are very important.
That's a really important point too, because for myself is I've had quite a path in my life, and when I was younger I pursued rebellious things pretty heavily, and I didn't have any faith in the government and all this kind of thing, and
common.
It's very common. I'm trying to say unique, but you know. And then prior to 2020, though, I was starting to come around to the idea that, I see, these structures and the governmental structures and are supposed to work for the betterment of the citizenry. That is what they're designed to do, and that the conception of like a democracy and the conception of the delegation of power to the provinces and to the municipalities and stuff, these are actually pretty good ideas, right? But they're not run by competent people a lot of the time, and they're and when I say incompetent in that context, I'm talking about they're looking for the shortcuts, they're looking for personal gains, they're looking, you know, they're not necessarily like pure evil, but they're just not up to the task of actually managing that role that has been designed in this framework. And so I started thinking, well, it's not the concept of democracy or concept of capitalism, it's the way that it played out. And then COVID came, and I went, the problem's so much worse than I thought. It's so much more ingrained, that these corruptions, but I still believe in the framework that has our society's built upon. The idea of Western society's concept of individual freedom is I believe in that. I believe in the idea of democracy as a better way of governing than, like, you know, dictatorial monarchy or something. But it's getting integrity and accountability put into those roles.
Well, and you see with, like, I mean, you mentioned kind of capitalism, right? Because this is a charged word for sure. Today, where and there, I think it's important that we realize that a lot of people who are, you know, some people are like, capitalism's the way to go. Other people are like, not so much. But and the people who are really criticizing capitalism are often criticizing it, I've noticed, from an angle which doesn't really make sense, because they don't realize that the capitalism they're criticizing is not kind of a more real form of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
They are it's more of like a crony capitalism.
Yeah.
Or when you see, like, let's say a corporation, and let's say they're tremendously influential with government, and then that's powering their profits. So that's not really like competition in the market, but it's not a free market competition based model at all. So that's
Yeah, and that's why I kind of mentioned that one too, right? It's healthcare, an example, or education. If you don't think about what's going on, you don't really know what's going on. The assumption is that it's what it's supposed to be, what we assume it is. But there's this disintegration of those values, of the values that prop it up properly. And if we don't engage as citizenry and say, hey, this is not going in a good direction, then it's going to get worse, because it's not going to statically stay where it is. It's going to go in a direction. And this is why I think that it's part of our role is to engage and to say, hey, there's things I don't like in society. Let's do something about it from a healthy and peaceful means, of course. But that's there for a reason. These protocols, these ability to push back against government policies is for a reason. And protesting is a right for a reason. You may not like some of the protests, and that's part of the game, right?
Freedom to protest and to express what you believe is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Those are kind of foundational to our democracy.
No, I teach martial arts, so I know I've studied violence, and I study it from many levels, not just the physical interaction dynamic, but the psychological side of it. And if you can't have free and difficult conversations, the conflicts that arise naturally, part of society, will degenerate into violence. That's where it goes ultimately. And if you look at human history, war and violence are more common than peace. And we have a very unique thing going on with the way that Western society has developed in the last couple hundred years, where the prosperity and the stable nature of, especially the middle class for the last 50 years in particular, is a unique phenomenon, and it's a special one. And I think people don't value that enough and see it for that.
Well, sure. I mean, if you look back, through history too, you obviously see that there's been far fewer democracies and far shorter periods of time where we've had democracies than other forms of government and more authoritarian forms of government. So it's nice to kind of live in a time where our freedoms are kind of valued, and that's important for our prosperity here as well. And one other point there is just that it's important to remember that while we face tremendous challenges, in the long arc at least, our prosperity is continuing to increase. We are ultimately doing better than we were 200 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And to be born today, we live a much higher, a better existence.
Absolutely.
Less of a struggle, perhaps.
And I think though that in martial art tradition, there's a lot of emphasis placed on gratitude. Because, at least within that context, it's gratitude for the knowledge, because it was created by many people who had to live and die by this stuff to be able to pass it along. And I think that idea of looking at society and saying, boy, am I grateful that I have hot and cold water on demand any moment I want it, right?
Yeah, what incredible technology.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Or the electricity that's powering everything in this room, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, like technology will continue to generate abundance.
Yes.
And prosperity for humanity,
right.
and we need to kind of have a foundation that allows that continue to occur.
So there's another major issue that ties into that I'd like to touch on with you, is to allow technology to continue to improve our lives and to sustain the infrastructure that we've developed. We need resources available for energy production.
Yes.
Right. And there's this idea that I mean, fundamentally, I don't like the idea that there's too many humans on the planet. I've never really thought, it's like, what do you mean? Like, who should go? Like, what are you talking about here, right? And there's this idea.
I like people, so it's good to have lots of people innovating and powering the human race forward. So and Elon Musk has talked about this a good bit, right? It's very important that we don't have significant population decline, and energy is absolutely foundational to humanity, and it's foundational to our prosperity, and low cost energy.
Yes.
So tying it back to the political side here a little bit, we've been very clear about the development of our LNG resources here in the province, our desire to do so, and those are important projects. Both because they can provide a low-cost source of energy to the world, but also because they can provide, tremendous kind of financial benefits to our province.
Yeah, and I think trying to reiterate to people that isn't the same thing as saying that I'd hate the environment and I want to pollute it, right? Like that confusion comes up a lot, it seems to me, and it's like, but if you want the environment to be protected, people need to have stable lives. Right, you're not going to want to do something abstract like protect the environment if you're desperate to get by.
Absolutely, and you in anywhere in the world, I mean, you can kind of see that as incomes rise, people care and take better care of their environment.
Yeah,
and that makes complete sense because once you have those kind of your basic needs met, you're going to spend more time and attention on other things.
Yeah, well, and that's like that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so there's this idea that we need to get rid of all the carbon forever, right? And it's like, well, what do you really want to get rid of here? Right? Like, what is really driving that? Because there's some weird elements to that framework that gets pushed by a lot of these people, where it's like, you want to fly in a private jet to complain about people who are barely getting by and using too much energy. Like, what are you doing? Like, it's very strange.
Yeah, and back to kind of locally here in British Columbia, we have growing energy needs as well. Mm-hmm. So obviously we've had the benefit of kind of tremendous hydroelectric resources in the province, and that generates a tremendous amount of power for us. But we also have major immigration into Canada, over 1 million people a year, and that's putting a strain on all our infrastructure, really, and we can tie that into housing, healthcare, education system, all of that. And we need power for those people. So in kind of the medium to longer term, the energy needs in this province are growing tremendously, and we'll need to address that. It's one of the reasons that we've kind of opened the conversation to nuclear as well, as a party, and because and I'm not an expert on this, but nuclear is a denser form of energy in the sense that you can create a tremendous amount of power without all the burning of the fossil fuels. So that's an interesting angle that we've kind of opened for discussion as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you are saying it that way too, because I think just opening to the discussion is a good way to start, right? You're not saying we're going to do this. You're saying let's talk about what we can do and then be realistic about the costs and benefits for all of these things.
Yeah, because like where are you going to get your power from? We know we need it. So you have you have wind and solar and fossil fuels and nuclear and these kind of options. And so then it's about putting together the best mix that makes the most sense, and really just taking a practical approach to that, to deliver low cost energy for people.
Yeah, and it comes back to a fundamental thing from all of the different subjects we've touched on, is just being honest about what's actually happening. Instead of being like, I have an ideological aim that I want to get rid of all the carbon, or I want to make everybody believe what I believe, and that's not part of reality. That's just in your head. And if you want to have sustainable energy production, you have to be honest about what that means and where you're going to get it from and how you're going to balance it out.
It's really like scarcity is not acceptable when it comes to energy. In the same way that scarcity is not acceptable when it comes to basic healthcare resources. These are things that we really need, or food, or these other we can't afford to kind of play around.
And if you think about it too, and this is something that I've thought about a lot, and it's because for a while in I guess it would be my late 20s, early 30s, I kind of fell into the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory things. And I found actually some interesting ideas out of it in a sense, because I sort of see how the psychology draws a person into that.
Did some of them end up being true, or were they all?
Well, see, that's it. Some of them kind of ended up being true, And I'll point out one that I know is controversial, but there's a guy named Alex Jones, and he's pretty controversial for sure. But he was talking about Jeffrey Epstein 10, 12 years ago, and it turned out that was right. And he, it sounded crazy when he was saying it. It was like there's sex islands that they have crazy underage whatever going on, and people are like, "You're nuts! That's the most crazy thing I've ever heard." Well,
that's a wild story.
Oh, yeah.
That I've seen in the media with Epstein Island and all that. Yeah, it's really kind of unbelievable. I try to stay. There's so much, there's so much going on in the world.
Yeah.
All over, and there's so many problems and kind of terrible things happening too.
Yeah.
For the most part, I try to stay focused relatively locally.
Yeah.
And I think that's incredibly important. There's kind of real tangible things that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
Right here in Vancouver, right here in the riding, right here in BC.
Well, that was one of the lessons I got from that, though, is that diving into that stuff was like, okay, it's getting so abstract and so disconnected from anything I can have any connection with in any way. And it is better to be local in that sense. But I only bring it up. I wouldn't even bring it up to necessarily point out one of the things that Alex Jones mentioned that was actually turned out to be right. I just mentioned to bring it up because the way that almost everything that's problematic that we have talked about in BC can be sort of divided into collectivism. So we've had a little bit of fun with the cameras, and I've learned a little bit more about how to use them. So this is valuable.
Part of the process.
Yeah, it is. It's part of everything in life. It is. So we've touched on a lot of important subjects, and I'm really glad that you understand and sort of resonate with the idea that there's an ideological framework connecting them all, because I think it makes it easier, even though it's not easy, but a little bit easier to make sense of, because it's not like that issue's over here is totally disconnected from this issue, right? The idea of top-down control is not helping. The idea that the individual needs to take responsibility for themselves. The idea that people's lives need to be directed through their own initiative and their own framework rather than having somebody always telling them what to do. And that there's ideological agendas going on that are very unhelpful, that are permeating into the schools, into the healthcare. Yeah.
Well, we talk a lot about common sense. If you'll hear Pierre talk about this, the common sense, the common people, this type of, and I think it's important that we get back to kind of the observable reality that we see around us. So walk down the streets of Vancouver. I would invite people to go and ask yourself, has the situation gotten better with the homeless people on the streets, or has it gotten worse in the last 10 years, 20 years, however long you've been here, whatever that looks like. And when you do that, and it's just kind of simple with healthcare, with education, with your tax bill, with the overdose deaths, with all of these, I would just say, is it better or worse than it was? And right now things have gotten a lot, I would say, worse in the last 6.5 years. We've seen debt double, the provincial government debt double. We've seen overdose deaths at record highs. We've seen homelessness and deaths associated with that rise significantly. We've seen housing costs just absolutely soar out of reach for a lot of people. And so ask that question, and then later this year you're going to have a chance to vote, as we get to do. And I would suggest it's time to vote for some change and a different option. Absolutely. This fall here in BC.
I would not only back that up, but I would also say that two things. I would say that we need to use the means that are available through the democratic system to make the change, because that's the best way to do it. And the other thing to people is just like, if you see something that in your guts, in your heart is not okay, don't second guess yourself. Understand that you have the ability to perceive and make decisions in that context. And don't let anybody come around and tell you that you have to agree with something you don't want to agree with just to be nice. That's not actually how it works. And
yeah. Oh, and that's one of the unhealthy ththings about kind of some of the cancel culture that we've seen, and kind of the restrictions on speech, is that in some cases they don't want you to necessarily, like, we haven't wanted people necessarily believe what they're seeing perhaps with their own eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll just try and cancel that out or whatever, as if it doesn't exist, but it does exist, and we see it every day.
Yeah. There's a quote in 1984 of George Orwell's novel that's like the ultimate proclamation from the regime is that what you see isn't what you see. Like that isn't really how it goes. And no, I'm not willing to go down that path. And I'm glad that you are standing up and getting yourself involved, and that the Conservative Party CBC has suddenly emerged as this force towards that end. And,
yeah, it's kind of an incredible moment. Yeah. I think really nationally that we're seeing this like national blue wave, a national conservative wave. Yeah. And it really seems like, I'm very optimistic. It seems like there's a tremendous kind of hunger for change in this country. Mm-hmm. And, I suspect the next 10 years will be, much better than the last 5 or 10. And it'll be great to see Trudeau gone and Evie as well. So, those two and many of their policies, I would say, have been tremendous failures. So,
absolutely. I 100% agree. I'm looking forward to seeing those things happen, but it'll take some work. So
absolutely,
keep the work going.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. So thank you for coming in, sharing some time and some thoughts. Very appreciated, Paul, and I wish you the best in the campaign ahead and all that.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for having me on.
All right.
Cheers.